Hi YouTube, this is Evie. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today I would like to discuss a little platitude that gets thrown around all over the place in BDSM. Be that at conferences, at conventions, at munches, on message boards, on FetLife, on YouTube, on Instagram, on Tumblr, on anywhere where BDSM people seem to congregate, this phrase gets thrown around all over the place. And that phrase would be, the submissive has all of the power. And today what I would like to do is kind of dissect that phrase a little bit. Go over what does it mean, why do people use it, what is it implying, how true is it, and just generally my thoughts and opinions about this particular phrase. Morgan Thorne has a great video on this particular subject as well. I think it's called, Do Submissives Really Have All the Power? Go watch that if you want to hear something from a dominance perspective. This is coming from me, my perspective, as a submissive person. So I think it's good to kind of see how people think about this from both sides of the slash. So what I first want to just briefly get out there in this video before I get too far into discussion, I am not trying to say that submissives don't have any power. I'm not saying that submissives shouldn't have any power. I'm not saying if a submissive is in a relationship where they have a significant portion of power that that's a bad thing. You get to negotiate for whatever relationship style works for you and what works for your partner and is consensual. You get to determine all of that. However, I do believe this particular phrase creates an imperfect picture of how a BDSM dynamic should actually ideally work if it is in fact fully consensual and is done fully aware of all the different elements of power exchange. I think the reason why the particular term submissives have all the power gets thrown around a lot is it's one of those quick, easy things that you can grab onto when you are a submissive or somebody who is interested in potentially becoming a submissive but wants to learn more about the lifestyle that can be quite reassuring. If you're not super familiar with how actual real power exchange works and maybe your really only exposure to it is erotica or pornography, or you really just don't know what it is actually like, the idea of having all of your power taken away by another person is terrifying, and I totally understand that. Well, at least for most people. For some people, it's just automatically hot and they go on their way, and that's perfectly okay as well. I would just maybe worry a little bit about sub-frenzy in that case. But anyways, I think it's something that people who are newer to the scene really hold on to because it's comforting in a way. It's saying, you know, you still really have all of your power. Nothing is being taken away from you. You still have all of the authority and you're still in charge of the relationship and you get to make all the decisions. And boy, isn't that powerful and wonderful. But that sort of, there's several things that I take issue with that particular perspective. I think we, again, totally should empower submissives. I think submissives should be aware of their own autonomy. I think submissives should know the inherent power that they have as human beings and only negotiate their power to be given to another person when they are fully understanding what that means. But the idea that somehow they have all of the power in the relationship dynamic is just wrong. If they wanted to have all of the power in the relationship, quote unquote, wouldn't they be dominants? Isn't that kind of the point of power exchange relationships, for the submissives to give up power to the dominant? That's what I think it means. But before I just leave it there and call it quits, I think let's go ahead and kind of read into more some of the different reasons why people justify using this particular phrase or why they think that this particular phrase applies. So the first justification that gets thrown out there right off the bat when people are communicating about this particular phrase and justifying why they think it's correct is, well, a submissive has a safe word. They're able to end a scene whenever it makes them uncomfortable or when it goes past their limits. That's great. Submissives do, in fact, have safe words. At least most of them have safe words anyways. Different relationship styles obviously don't play with safe words. I have some videos talking about that, but it's just flatly wrong that submissives are the only one with safe words. Safe words is not the thing that gives you power in a dynamic. Now, with dominance, it is uncommon, or at least less common, for them to have a clear verbal safe word like banana or red like a submissive would. That's not to say that they don't use them or never use them. I know people who are dominants who have read it out of scenes. My own partner has actually done that before, and there are people who are dominants who use safe words. I think it's dangerous to have this assumption that somehow dominants don't need safe words, they don't have safe words, because that can potentially lock in an experienced dominant into thinking that they just have to continue with the scene until the submissive says that they're over, which is not the case. BDSM always comes from a platform of two equal parties negotiating to have a power exchange happen or some kind of play happen, and that can only continue when both parties continue to consent, not only when the submissive continues to consent. A dominant has the right, the privilege, the ability to also end a scene, be that with a safe word, be that with just refusing to continue the scene, be that with ending a relationship. Actually, that reminds me of the second point, is the submissive always has the ability to walk away from the relationship. That's also true. I wouldn't disagree with that. A submissive should always have the ability to walk away from a relationship. This is one of the ways that BDSM can potentially turn into abuse, is when you have potentially a less than perfectly informed submissive, or a submissive who maybe doesn't understand the potential ramifications of a certain style of contract, that they're never ever allowed to leave until their dominant gives them permission. They can only be released when the dominant removes their collar. They are locked into this for life. They have signed it with their blood, and they have to stay there for eternity. Now, again, some people do have contracts like that, and it works out for them, and I'm not judging anybody who does that. Everybody has their own way and flavor of doing BDSM, but submissives ideally should always have the option to walk away from a relationship, but the same is also true for dominants. It's the same as the safe word thing. It's dangerous to have this idea that submissives are the only ones who really have permission to walk away from a relationship, that they're the only ones who would need to walk away from a relationship. Submissives can be toxic, they can be abusive, they can be any level of guilty for a lot of the same things that a dominant can be. It just tends to be less forward, it tends to be more passive aggressive, it tends to be more manipulative than it is outright physically abusive, like the way a lot of people visualize dominance abusing submissive. So it gets kind of buried, and I would love to have another video where maybe I discuss potential submissive toxicity, or how doms can be abusing relationships, because I definitely think that needs to be talked about, it needs to be addressed, especially for young dominants who are, again, getting fed all of these lines and the assumptions that I get locked into the, how do I end this relationship? The submissive is depending on me. They need me to do these things for them. How do I leave? And they're getting mentally trapped, or they feel like they don't have the authority to be able to leave because they've made a commitment to the submissive, and the submissive is the one who has to be released, and it just gets messy. And I really think it just logically makes sense that, again, this is based on two equals coming together and both having consent to this relationship, and either party can end that consent at any time for any reason, and there shouldn't be any hangups about that, ideally. So another logic behind this particular phrase is the idea that submissives have limits and boundaries, and the dominant has to stay within those limits and boundaries in order for the play to continue to be consensual. So ultimately they have the authority in the relationship because their limits and boundaries are what shape the parameters of what the relationship would look like. Again, this is based on a grain of truth. I think that it is definitely true that most, if not all, submissives should have some idea of what their limits and boundaries are, that they should communicate those to potential partners, and that those should be respected by their partners. However, this once again is creating a toxic perspective where dominants don't have limits and boundaries, their limits and boundaries can't be violated, that they shouldn't communicate them with the submissive. They're the dominant, they don't need limits and boundaries. What could a submissive possibly do to violate those boundaries? They're not the one topping during play, and it's just... Why? Why is it so hard to believe that dominants would have limits and boundaries, and that it's not just one person's limits and boundaries that are shaping their relationship, but two people's boundaries together shaping a relationship? I have limits around things that Mr. Tex really enjoys. Mr. Tex has limits around things that I really enjoy, and together those two things make our relationship. I would never ask Mr. Tex, who's my dominant, to do a kind of play that he was uncomfortable with, because I'm conscious of what his limits are, and it would be me violating him to ask him to do that type of play, or to force him to do that type of play. Where a lot of this is leading to, and why I have so much problem with all of these perspectives, is, again, it's ignoring the fact that dominants are allowed to have their own boundaries and their own ability to remove consent from a potential relationship, but that also dominants are somehow pictured as these awful, monstrous people, that were it not for the submissive having things like safe words, boundaries, having any kind of ability to remove themselves from the relationship, that they would be abused, manipulated. The dominant would just push them and push them and push them and get as much out of them as they possibly can, like they were trying to squeeze an orange. Like, that's not true, and I think that's a really bad way to talk about dominance. Dominants have to go through enough issues already when it comes to finding their footing in BDSM and not feeling like monsters and not feeling like they're awful people for having sadistic desires, for wanting to humiliate people, for wanting to tie people up. We shouldn't be adding on to that by, once they're already in the scene, telling them all these things that, you know, well, a submissive has all the power because they can leave the relationship, because they have boundaries, because they have safe words. While all of those are factually correct, it puts the dominant in a position where they hear that kind of thing and they think, gosh, if they didn't have safe words and limits in these things, the people just think I'm going to be violating them all over the place, or they think that I'm going to ignore all of these things that they're not clearly communicated. And don't get me wrong, dominants can absolutely abuse submissives. Dominants can absolutely take advantage of people. They can ignore established limits. They can ignore what has been negotiated. All of that happens, and I'm not trying to erase that. I'm just trying to talk about how it makes dominants seem like they're awful people, and if they didn't have this cage of rules and things around them that the submissive is the only one who has, that they would just be monsters. And that's not true, and that's why I have such a problem with this phrase, is because it's not that submissives have all of the power. Submissives have some of the power. Dominants have some of the power. And all other things being equal, if you look at all of this, and we go through all those items of what people use to justify this phrase, submissives are not the only one with safe words, they're not the only one with limits, they're not the only ones who can remove themselves from a relationship at any time. That goes both ways. So just looking at all of those facts, they have equal power. What makes it less than equal power, what changes the distribution of power, is the consent of the submissive to give up a portion of that power that they have for themselves and give permission to the dominant to have a portion of that power. So really, submissives have some of the power. Dominants, generally speaking, will have slightly more, but either party can revoke consent to any degree of power exchange that they want at any time. That is ideally how it should work out. Now, I know I had a lot of thoughts in this video, and again, I think there are some specific subsets of this topic that I want to go into more detail with. I want to talk more about being a new dominant in the scene, being comfortable with your dominance. I want to talk about maybe some of the toxic language and phrases that we use in BDSM and how that prevents us from necessarily having a perfect BDSM world, or how that can interfere with a new person's perspective on what power exchange is really like. And I think what's ultimately important to remember about this is submissives don't have all of the power because they don't want all of the power. That's why they're submissives. That's why they have chosen or are drawn to this particular role, is because it allows them to give up a portion of that power. And if they ultimately have all of the power in the relationship, again, why would they be submissives? And just to reiterate one more time, and I am going to make a separate video about this as well, is we should encourage submissives to have power. We should encourage submissives to embrace their own autonomy, to recognize their own authority as people, to make consensual decisions. They should be empowered to establish their limits and boundaries with what makes them comfortable, not comfortable what their partner desires. But really, that's where I want to leave it today. If you guys have any comments or questions, please let me know in the comment section down below. If you want to find me on my social media, if you want to ask me questions, best place to do that is Tumblr or Instagram. I will leave links down to that in the description box below. If you haven't already, please do subscribe to my channel. I make videos twice a week talking about BDSM and sexuality and all of that great stuff. If you like this channel and you want to support my channel and help me do more things like live streams and photo shoots and have exclusive content like videos and a private chat with me, I will leave a link to my Patreon down below if you want to check that out. I absolutely love being able to interact with my Patreon members, and I love being able to make more content because of Patreon, because honestly, I don't even know if I would be on YouTube if it was not for Patreon. Anyways, that's all I wanted to say for today. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.